As you look at this worksheet called Auditing Tools in our Chapter 1 file, you can imagine wanting to know, for example, which cells depend on a certain cell. After looking at this worksheet for a few minutes, you might have discovered cell B3 is pretty important. You see it's referred to in cell B7 as you click on that cell. And then you begin to realize, too, that some of the cells that use B3 also are further referred to by other cells. What you want to know at certain times is which cells depend upon B3. Phrased differently, if I change cell B3, which other cells can change? We're looking for the dependencies of cell B3. Doing this manually would take quite some time, and there'd always be that nagging feeling that you might have missed a reference somehow. Fortunately, on the Formulas tab in the ribbon, in the Formula Auditing group, we've got an option called Trace Dependence. Show arrows that indicate which cells are affected by the value. Right now, cell B3 is selected. Let's click this button, Trace Dependence, and immediately we see arrows pointing to cells that have references to B3. But some of those cells might be further referred to by other cells, so keep clicking Trace Dependence. If you've got a speaker on, you'll hear beeps, 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 and then suddenly no more beeps. If you're just based on the visuals, at some point no additional lines will appear. Trace Dependence. There we are. All of these cells that have a blue dot or arrow in them, in some way or another, depend upon cell B3. Many times it's 2 or 3 formulas removed. And sometimes you might see, as we do in this case, a dashed line. And what the dashed line means, and it's pointing to an icon representing a worksheet, there is a formula in another worksheet, either in this workbook or in another open workbook, that relates back to, in this case, cell G5. I'm going to click near cell G5, use the down arrow, and stop right on cell G5. There's nothing in the formula here that in any way suggests that a formula elsewhere is getting data from here. And so in addition to helping us understand this worksheet, this trace dependence feature also alerts us to the idea that there are formulas elsewhere that use data from this worksheet. That means if we change cell B3, not only could it have impact on all these different cells in this worksheet, but also possibly on another worksheet. Double-click the dashed line. It tells us where that relationship exists, and this is on a different worksheet in the current workbook. Update values. You see it at the bottom of the screen, green tab. If we double-click this or click OK, we jump to that worksheet, and there's that formula. It's in cell A11. I'll double-click it, and what does it say? Get data from cell G5 in that worksheet that we just saw called Auditing Tools. Let's go back to Auditing Tools. Now, another thing you might consider doing as you view this screen, you might, for documentation purposes, might want to print this. I'll simply press Control-P to remind you how that might look, and that could serve as a source of documentation. Now, what you also might want to do, and I've already done it here, but over on the left-hand side, go to Page Setup, and on that Sheet tab here, show the grid lines and row and column headings. This isn't mandatory, of course, but if you do that, you got a better case for saying this is what the worksheet is doing, and this helps understand what's going on. Let's escape from here. Now, if we wanted to show the dependencies of another cell, we better remove the arrows first. That's a choice we have up in the Formula Auditing toolbar. Remove arrows. Now, the so-called opposite direction is sometimes just as or more important. We're looking at a bottom line total in cell L26. It's got a simple formula in it, but here too, possibly those other cells, L11, K26, they might have formulas as well too. If we go to cell L11, double-click, it's getting data based on information in 2 other cells. So how do we track backwards, so to speak? In other words, let's find all the cells which, if altered, could impact the total in cell L26. The opposite of dependence is precedence. Click it once, but keep clicking as we did with dependence. And here too, same general idea. At some point, if your speaker's on, you'll no longer hear the beeps. And if you're strictly observing the lines, at some point, no additional ones will appear. So looking backward, you might say, we're looking at all cells which, if altered, could have impact on this total. And here too, we might, and we do in this case, see a dashed line. This is coming out of cell F13. If I click cell F13, you can see in the formula in this case that it is getting data from elsewhere. It's getting data from that other sheet. And we can double click this if we wish, as in the prior example with dependence, and possibly track that down that way as well too, and jump over and take a look at that. But I think you can see here in both cases really valuable tools for helping us make sense. I don't envy anybody who has to do auditing, but in certain cases it's really valuable and, of course, sometimes necessary. Here, too, eventually we would want to remove arrows. In both cases for these features, there are keystroke shortcuts, not quite as good as the command because we will not see lines, but we will see highlighting. I'm going to go to cell B3 again and press Control-Shift-Right bracket. The right bracket key typically is 2 keys to the right of the letter P on most keyboards. Control-Shift-Right bracket highlights all the cells that have a dependency on cell B3. You might want to add a color here. This does not show any dependencies that might exist on a different worksheet, and we know from our previous example there is one here, so we're not seeing that. And perhaps just as important in some cases, if we go to cell L26, if we want to show the precedence here quickly, it's Control-Shift-Left bracket. That highlights all the cells which, if altered, could have impact on cell L26. So we've seen 2 valuable commands for helping us audit worksheets: trace precedence and trace dependence, found on the Formula Auditing group in the Formulas tab in the ribbon. And we saw 2 keystroke shortcuts related to those 2 features.